humor here to give us a talk to entertain us. Mr. Tom Palmer, please welcome.
I have to use this mic here, okay. I'm going to talk about free trade and the liberation of humanity from poverty, oppression, and war. Free trade is at the heart of the cause of liberty. It's not a peripheral issue. It is not an optional issue. It is at the very core of everything we believe in. If you want to understand how nations grow rich, you need to understand trade. It enriches the people, increases innovation and the spread of useful innovations, reduces the chances of going to war. It is the single best policy for a country to become peaceful, rich, and free. So let me start, though, by talking a little bit about some of the reasons that people oppose trade. Opponents point that, yes, there are beneficiaries, but always they'll point out to this person who will lose if trade barriers are reduced. And those few people are normally very visible, and they are very vocal. And they dominate the public discussion. But let's look at both the costs and the benefits of reducing trade barriers. For a moment, we'll move towards a purely utilitarian approach. People trade in the expectation of benefit, so that's our starting point. People do not voluntarily trade expecting to be made worse off. So both parties expect to gain from a trade. Nonetheless, anytime there are two willing participants who expect to gain, there may be third parties who would expect to lose. And they're the ones who dominate the discussion. Imagine I've bought at one store my groceries for 20 years. That's where I always shop. And then I decide to shop at another store because I like the price and the service and the quality more there. The owners of the first store will lose because they lose my business. And the owners of the second store and I benefit from the trade that we consummate. Not surprisingly, the owners of the first store are likely, in a political market, to try to get the competition crushed. But in a free market, their response is to try to get me back by offering better services, lower prices, better quality. That's how markets work. If they go to the state to restrict my ability to buy from the second store, they hurt people by forbidding mutually beneficial exchange. Professor Byland expressed this very elegantly yesterday. The harm that comes from forbidding voluntary exchanges. We know that allowing freedom of choice and competition offers many more benefits than restraint, which only benefits the cronies and the special interests and the loud, vocal minority interests. Let's turn back now and say, why do we trade in the first place? Why not just make everything for ourselves? Instead, we all produce something and trade the results with other people. We specialize what we can produce at lower cost, and lower cost should not be understood just in terms of money. It means what we give up when we make a choice. So we produce the things we can make at lower cost and buy things from other people who can make them at lower cost. Mercedes-Benz makes cars, but they don't make tires. Why? They buy the tires from another firm who can produce them at lower cost. All business firms and all individuals face the decision, make or buy. That's how I learned it when I took business classes. Make it or buy it. Which one comes at less cost? I apply that in my own life. I could make my own clothes, but I don't.
Thank goodness.
Yes. I do something else, I'm paid for it, and I buy the clothes from other people who can make them at lower cost. Now here's the key. That principle is applicable universally. It doesn't matter whether I buy from the person across town, across a provincial border, or across the other side of the world. There's nothing special about international trade. This is a very important point. We always hear, no, that's different. Buying something from Xinjiang if you're in Shanghai, that's inside China. Or from Texas if you're from Maine, that's inside America. There's no difference when you introduce an arbitrary line drawn by political powers. Adam Smith put it very neatly many years ago. One should never attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry, employed in a way in which we have some advantage. And that language is quite interesting. So I wanted to look a little bit at globalization. This is not a Western or American concept. It's a universal concept. And in China, this was understood. The saying of the people of Hangzhou is based on the principle of trade. Vegetables come from the east, water from the west, and so on. Let me look then at this idea of comparative advantage that Adam Smith hinted at. This is, I think, it may be the most important single theorem in economics that is not widely understood. If you grasp this, you will know more about economics than all the members of the Mongolian and American Congress and Parliament put together. Now, that's a low bar, but we can do better than that. When we specialize and use comparative advantage, we can consume more than we can produce. It sounds like a paradox. Let me show how. Imagine we have an economy with two goods, apples and fish. So I make this very simple. We could add more elements. And we have two people. I've used a random name generator, Kaliyun and Tom. These are randomly generated by my computer. And imagine that Kaliyun has an absolute advantage in production of both. She's really good at catching fish and catching apples. If Tom specializes only in apples, he can gather 50. And if he specializes only in fish, it means all day long, only appling or only fishing, he can get 50. In the same day, Kaliyun can gather 100 fish or 200 apples. Kaliyun is better at everything. She has the absolute advantage. There's a technical word in modern economics to describe Tom. Tom is a loser. Right? He can't do anything well. And Kaliyun is just better at everything. So why would Kaliyun want to trade with a loser like Tom? Well, let's look at how it works. Imagine they produce in isolation. And each one of them had mothers who said, eat a balanced diet. Not all apples or all fish, but some fish and some apples. So they divide their time. 50% of the time is apples and 50% is fish. Tom will gather, I don't know if I can make this work here, 25 fish and 25 apples. Kaliyun will get 50. Remember, she could get 100 fish, but she divides it by 50%. She could get 200 apples if she appled all day, but she gets 100. So the mathematical ratios are constant. There's nothing special or weird or no trick about this. Now, I'm going to make this work. What is happening here?
Point it out.
We're missing our person here to click it and something happened. Oh, there we go, okay. Kaliyun, besides being a really good worker, is smarter than Tom. No surprise. And she comes and says, I propose that we trade. I'll give you 37 apples for 25 of your fish. So Tom's goes out of apple production, he drops from 25 to 0, and he goes to fish production, he goes from 25 to 50. That's, again, mathematical ratios are constant. Oops. What have I done here? Yeah? This device is faulty. Okay. Kalyan went from 50, she reduces by 50% to 25. She goes from 100, she increases by 50% to 150. So there's no magic involved in this. Then they trade. Tom had 25 fish, Kalyan had 50, they shift over. Okay, now one more. So I'll just say switch. Okay, next. Okay. Tom had 50 fish, Kalyan had 25, he shifts over 25. They now both have the same they would have had in the absence of trade. Kalyan had 150 apples, she sends 37 to Tom. 37 is 12 more than Tom would have had without trade. And 113 is 13 more than Kalyan would have had without trade. This is shocking. This is so weird. How is it possible that just by specializing and exchanging, both of them will have more? Well, next slide. Think about it. Although Kalyan has the absolute advantage in everything, Tom is the lowest cost producer of fish. One fish, if you remember, cost Tom 1 apple. And for Kalyan, one fish costs her 2 apples. Her cost of production is double. So there's an advantage for each of them to produce what they make at lowest cost, means what you give up is less, in order to trade. This is one of the most important principles, and as Ludwig Mises argued, it's really the foundation of social order in general. If, in fact, I looked at any one of you and said, your interest is contrary to mine, we could not live together. It's the fact that your interest can be complementary to mine, that we can both benefit, that makes society possible. So, the question then is, looking at the data, trade is very robustly coordinated with, next, with prosperity. Next. It's a chart I like to show. There are many different versions of this. Angus Madison was the pioneer of it. Per capita income around the world. You can disaggregate it. It has some somewhat interesting characteristics. I gave a paper that was published by Cambridge University Press at a conference on poverty. And one of the questions was, what causes poverty? There were thinkers of various perspectives in the colloquium. There was a Christian thinker who was a socialist, a Jewish thinker who was a socialist, a Muslim thinker who was a socialist who was a socialist, a feminist who was a socialist, and on, and me. And I was the only one who said, that's a bad question. It's a badly formulated question. And I quoted Sir Peter Bauer, poverty has no cause. Wealth has causes. Poverty is what you get when you fail to produce wealth. In contrast, wealth is not what you get when you failed to produce poverty. We tried all day to make everyone poor. We failed and they became rich. It's not how the world works. People have to create wealth. What makes that possible? And we know. We have very good evidence on this. It's markets. It's respect for property. It's the freedom to trade. And important among them, the freedom to trade with foreigners outside of your own community. Next. We can see, even just in recent years, a dramatic decline in poverty. Most people, when asked this question, do not know. They say, is poverty going up or down in the world? It's collapsing in response to trade. Not only the percentage of the world population in trade, but the absolute number as world population has increased. This is stunning. In your lifetimes, even true of the youngest people here, you have seen the greatest poverty reduction in the history of the human race that is happening before our eyes. If you take it from about 1820, which is where this begins, go next, The per capita income, conservatively estimated, has gone up at least 44 times in wealthy countries, and even in the poorest countries in the world, the most desperate places, at least 10 times. And those are very conservative estimates, not taking into account increases in technological improvements and quality of goods. So, the protectionists say, well, there's a race to the bottom. Has there been? No. There has not been any race to the bottom. The data show otherwise. The most recent International Labor Organization 2019 report on world employment showed that between 1993 and 2018, the share of people in low and middle income countries working in extreme poverty, which they define as per capita consumption at $1.90 a day, purchasing power parity adjusted to 2011 dollars, and so on, dropped from almost 42% in 1993 to less than 10% in 2018. That's over 600 million people escaping extreme poverty. Most of them went from subsistence farming into paid work, and that means many other benefits, access to health care, educational, workplace safety, and so on. Moreover, it was not a shift from idyllic farm life that's happy out on the farm. Anyone who's lived on a farm knows this is not characterized real farm life, into satanic mills. In fact, the share of industrial workers in low and middle income countries did not change. The growth in employment took place in construction, retail trade, transportation, and service sectors. At the same time that inflation-adjusted real wages roughly tripled in low and middle income countries. Between 2000 and 2016, child labor, defined as laborers between the ages of 5 and 17, fell dramatically by 94 million, a trend that is continuing as children move from the field to the school in response to rising family incomes. And in addition, a number of studies have documented liberalization of trade is causally associated with increased gender equality, especially as experiencing increased health care and education. Trade has made the world better. There's a race to the top that is taking place, not a race to the bottom. And finally, there's a view of international trade that should have been abandoned about 100 years ago. That there's an American car, or a German car, or a Brazilian car. There aren't any such things anymore. Global supply chains are so complex and so long. We'll take the case of my iPhone, which I think I have here. I left it on the table. My iPhone, it says, assembled in China and designed in Cupertino, California. They have one now that says assembled in India, by the way. It's considered a Chinese product or an Indian product if imported into the US. But of the roughly $370 in components for an iPhone X, $110 goes to Samsung Electronics for the display, $44.75 to Toshiba Corporation of Japan and SK Hynix of South Korea. And then there are more parts brought in from Taiwan, Europe, and elsewhere. So the parts are assembled in China, where the labor accounts for between 3 and 6% of total manufacturing costs, but it's labeled a Chinese product. It's a global product. There are no more Chinese or American or Brazilian or Italian products. In addition, a very important principle known as the Lerner symmetry thesis that should be understood. A tax on imports has in the aggregate the same impact as a tax on exports. Donald Trump and other mercantilists cannot understand this no matter how many times it's explained to them. When you make it harder to import, you make it harder to export. You protect a job in an import-sensitive industry by destroying a job in an exporting industry, which means you are saving low-wage jobs and destroying higher-wage jobs. Free trade means prosperity and human flourishing and moving up the wage ladder for employees. Let me conclude with some thoughts on peace. So next. Free trade is the best guarantor of peace. There is a statement often attributed falsely to Frederick Bastiat, my hero. I've never found it in any of Bastiat's writings. Somebody said it at some point. When goods cannot cross borders, armies will. And it is a very important insight. Trade creates parties on both sides of a border who have an interest in maintaining peace. Every time a voluntary trade takes place across the border, there are at least two parties who want to maintain peaceful relations. Next. John Prince Smith, a member of the German Reichstag, who was a great enemy of Bismarck. Bismarck hated him personally. He said he had the soul of an English shopkeeper rather than of a German Prussian militarist. But John Prince Smith put it neatly. The international interconnection of the interests resulting from freedom of trade is the most effective means for the prevention of war. Had we advanced so far as to see a good customer in every foreigner, there would be much less inclination to shoot him. And that is a key and important insight, to see foreigners as potential trading partners rather than as enemies. Next. In addition, a great deal of econometric work has been done on the relationship between trade and peace. Even the volume of trade between countries is a pretty good indicator of the likelihood of armed conflict. Next. And Professor Eric Gartsky at University of California, San Diego, talks about the capitalist peace. We've heard about the democratic peace, which is a fairly good predictor of trade. Democracies are not very likely to go to war with each other. But as he pointed out, what's doing the work is the economic component. Next. So if you look at these dashed lines or the confidence intervals in the statistical analysis, there is evidently a relationship between democracy, an inverse relationship between democracy and willingness to go to war. The more democratic, the less likely. But notice the confidence intervals diverge pretty robustly. He then broke down, he said, well, but most democracies have free trade, or relatively more free trade than autocracies and dictatorships. So he then broke down the data, next, and looked at the relationship between economic freedom and likelihood to go to war. That is really robust. And he argues that's what's doing the work in the discussion of the democratic peace. It's the trading relationship. Next. We should also point out that the first Nobel Peace Prize winner, Frédéric Passy, was known as a free trader. That was why he got the Nobel Peace Prize. The doctrine of prohibition, of restriction, not only preaches isolation and desolation, but it condemns mankind to enmity and hatred. And what have we just heard now? I focus on Donald Trump because you can't escape him any place on the planet. He just designated Mexico a hostile foreign power. Mexico is the enemy of the United States in his worldview. And that is what the protectionist mentality leads to. You designate others as the enemy rather than seeing them as potential friends. Let me conclude with a little bit of poetry. Trade civilizes us. It's what converts us from savages into civil beings. There's a great poem, you may have heard of it, with the figure Homer. He has a TV show in America, if you're interested. But he also was a poet. And in the Odyssey, there's a powerful passage about the Cyclops. When Odysseus lands on the island of the Cyclops, he's not very nice. He's a savage. He attacks and eats the men. And when Odysseus says, what is my guest gift? Because in Greek culture, it was traditional, if you wash up on someone's island, they would give you a gift, food, water, clothing, and then you could go on your island, on your way. It was a reciprocity-based system. You might end up in the same situation. What is my guest gift? And the Cyclops says, I will eat you last. And then Homer asks, why is the Cyclops a savage? The Cyclops have no ships with crimson prows, no shipwrights there to build them good strong craft that could sail them out to foreign ports of call, as most men risk the seas to trade with other men. The Cyclops is a savage because he lives in the ideal world of the anti-globalization movement. All production and consumption is local. He's a locavore. he doesn't engage in trade. The cause of free trade is the cause of humanity. It is moral, it is smart, it is just. It is the most important path to human flourishing, uplift, liberation, and enlightenment. And it is the path to peace. I've dedicated my life to the cause of freedom of trade because I believe in liberty and dignity and the relief of poverty and suffering and peace. And I urge all of you to join me in that crusade. Thank you.